Master ceremony, right? We start.
Yes, I think we are good to go. I actually quickly want to pass it, since all the attendees are already joining in. I pass it on to you, Alex, to set the context.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Depending where you are joining from, we are very happy to greet you from Bangkok Regional Hub, from the Regional Innovation Center, for the kickoff. What is really, I would say, inspiring series of webinars with a pretty stellar setup that we will be having from now on. I definitely don't want to take too much time because there are so many people who are much more knowledgeable than me. So I will just make a brief, very brief introduction. We are very happy, as I said, to webinar. This is part of our kicking off work around data for policy that is supported also by our partners from Rockefeller Foundations Asia. I think if I would give a very kind of a short tagline for this series of webinar, I would say we are looking beyond technology, apps, and dashboards when we are talking about digital transformation and data. No surprise, no news that digital transformation was kind of a highlight during unfolding COVID pandemics and kind of this receding phase we are in, but unfortunately so much attention was on technology, on apps, on data availability, that I think we sometimes have forgotten to what extent digital and data are actually human and have to deliver as part of human systems. So with these webinars and with the people who will be shortly introduced and presented to you, we really want to provide the framing for what digital transformation and data policy need to mean in post-COVID time if you really want to have a inclusive green post-COVID rebound. We also, what we wanted to do with kicking off these webinars, as we talk about human systems and systems overall, to start kind of a movement, right? I don't think that change in the way how public sector works and how it interacts with citizens, in how our systems operate is possible if people don't change. What we really want to do with this work is to bring together people who aspire for change, but also people who have done a lot in terms of changing systems in their own jurisdictions, in their own roles and capacities across the last couple of years. So in a way, we want this to move from being an academic perspective or academic conversation about how we do change to something that is practical, something that we can really deliver in the next couple of years, and something that we can trigger for years to come. So this is effectively the aspiration to demystify digital and data, to show how it important and works in human systems, and at the same time to look how we can build movement between country offices and between obviously the decision makers that are working with UNDP in Asia. So with this framing and with this introduction, I'm really happy to pass the floor to our lead facilitator and our key partner in crime for this work, Claire Curran, who is former Digital Minister of New Zealand and who will be taking over from me from now on for this webinar, and will set the scene and we'll introduce all the distinguished speakers that we have here. Over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome, everyone. It's a great privilege to be facilitating this webinar. And I'll just say a few words about myself to introduce myself. As Alex has said, my name is Claire Curran. I was a cabinet minister in the New Zealand government in 2018 and a long-time politician. I was responsible for the development of policy inside government to stimulate digital innovation with a common set of standards and services across government, digital inclusion for all New Zealanders, and an emphasis on stimulating and expanding the digital economy. now retired from politics, I'm deeply interested in organisations and networks and collaboration that support effective and accountable government and a just and inclusive society. We've got some great speakers today, and this will be an informative and thought-provoking discussion looking at what joined-up, seamless service provision to citizens looks like and how it can be backed by best practice digital and data governance. And of course, identifying the challenges and pitfalls is how we can move to true digital transformation. All of us at some point in our lives interact with government and public services. Those interactions between government and citizens in many countries have progressively moved from face-to-face or by phone to digital, from getting a visa, a marriage license, a birth and death certificate, a driver's license, a passport, receiving government support and assistance, enrolling a child in school or tertiary education, paying tax, paying fines, entering and leaving prison, accessing medical records and sometimes accessing health treatment. All of these interactions are increasingly only available online. Despite admirable policy intentions by governments to deliver equitable services through public-friendly interfaces, there are considerable barriers and challenges due to the perpetuation of status quo systems dependent on hierarchical silos and sometimes complex, muddled decision-making, resulting in inconsistent and often undignified services that embed social exclusion. But there are signs of progress. Life journey mapping, investment in policy laboratories within the public service, common digital design standards and open data program of policy, platforms in practice are driving successful digital public service delivery in countries that are committed to an all-of-government vision, horizontal visibility and programs across agencies involving citizens, non-government organisations, and to some extent the private sector in their design and delivery. Our three speakers today will touch on progress in a range of countries. And before I introduce them, I'll quickly run through how the webinar will proceed. You'll hear from our three speakers, and while they're talking, Afrin from UNDP will put up a poll asking you a couple of quick questions and that you can answer while you're listening. Afrin will announce the result of the poll after the first speaker. We really want this to be an interactive session. You're taking time out of your busy lives, so please place questions and comments in the chat before the presentations, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. After our three presenters, I'll introduce the panel and we'll leave time for your questions to be answered. So now to our speakers. Julie Bedard is the manager of the Life Journey program. As an employee at the Government of Canada since 2000, she's worked in various management positions and joined the Benefits Delivery Modernisation team in 2020. She knows well the issues faced by Canadian employees and citizens. Julie has witnessed many transformations in government over the past 22 years and has, among other things, participated in the implementation of projects such as video chat and client-centric policy. She believes in the life journey approach to design unique and tailored experiences across services, effectively integrate and coordinate service providers, and better guide Canadians through their journey. She's joined by Stephanie Figgis, who's a product manager working on establishing the new Service Canada Digital Centre as part of Employment and Social Development Canada's Benefits Delivery Modernisation. Her mission is to make it easier for residents of Canada to find the information they need so that they can access Service Canada's benefits and services. Because of the time difference, Julie and Stephanie's presentation will be brought to you via a pre-recorded video.
We don't have the sound.
Watching us speak to you from Canada to talk about our experience setting up a life journey program here at the government department responsible for social benefits, Service Canada. First, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking from is the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki people.
And I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm speaking from is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, and this territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And we also acknowledge that Canada is on land that is the traditional and unceded territory of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people.
We also want to thank Claire Karen for inviting us to speak to you today. And before we get into talking about life journeys, I would like to take a moment to describe the Canadian context. Canada is a federation composed of provinces and territories where responsibilities are divided between federal, municipal, and provincial level. What this means is that many levels of government and organization all work to provide social services to residents, but have separate authorities in what they provide. So why is our department taking a life journey approach? Well, we were inspired by the work in Australia. We like that this work takes a new approach to mapping out journeys by taking a whole life view of a person experiencing a life event rather than a siloed view of a government benefit. Let me explain. You may have heard about customer life cycle maps, business process maps, and customer journey maps. All these types of maps look at one service, for example, applying for a benefit or sending money to another person. A life journey map is different because it looks at a person's needs during a life event, independent of one service. This is a 10,000-foot view that lets us see multiple services at once. For example, instead of applying for a benefit, perhaps a maternity benefit, we might look at the life journey of a person having a child. When we look at the life journey, we will see that along with this person applying for a maternity benefit, they will also apply for child tax benefits and a social insurance number. By zooming out and seeing the whole picture, we can see where other government departments are also providing services to a person at the same time. This lets us find opportunities to improve and bundle services. Life journeys can also let us see where non-government organizations are interacting with people related to those life journeys. For example, when a loved one passes away, a family member might interact with a funeral service, which may also provide other services centered around helping the family interact with the government. So this 10,000-foot view can also help us go to where it is the most convenient for people, rather than making people go to the government. How did we start? For our first try at mapping a life journey, we chose to map the journey that a person experiences to become a parent. We call this the new child journey. We mapped the journey by talking to people from different backgrounds who had different experiences with having a new child. For example, a newborn through natural birth or in vitro and adoption. As you can see, we identified 4 major stages: planning, anticipating, welcoming, and the new normal. And then we identified on the map the different actions and service providers during each day. Even though there are a lot of overlapping moments during each batch, our map really shows how complex all the path could be with all the different possibilities. And seeing all these possibilities led us to prototyping an information service to help residents navigate through these complexity and different paths. During our initial research, we heard that people don't know what they don't know or where to find this info. So having a map that shows all the possible moments is something that can help people make the right decisions while they are living a particular journey. To test this opportunity, we made a prototype where people could interact with the website and do a sort of choose your own adventure to learn about the different pathways and key moments and service providers in their journey. What we learned is that there are a lot of other governments and non-government organizations that touch the same moment in the life of a person.
This really highlights the challenges that a life journey approach has in a country like Canada, because there's so many different authorities and providers in the journey. And one of the biggest obstacles is that the inclusion of information from many different jurisdictions makes it hard to start small, because to do it right, it still requires a lot of work to coordinate, verify information, and present it in a way that doesn't overwhelm the user, which in turn makes it hard to prove value early. This has caused us to scale back for our second life journey. So right now, instead of looking at the entire becoming a senior journey, we're scaling back to look at how the old age security program, which is an income support for seniors, fits into the becoming a senior journey. Other challenges we have are the government doesn't have a full picture of the challenges of its residents. There is no one solution per journey, so prioritizing service improvements can be challenging. The people who stand the most to benefit from our work are the hardest to find, which results in us improving the happy path, but not always the rocky path for the people who have the most barriers. And undertaking a life journey program in a country as large and complex as Canada raises the question of whether the public service can even buy into and commit to running a life journey program that is truly omni-jurisdictional. And lastly, in our user research on the information service, the people we met mentioned wanted to have all the information in one place, but we also heard questions on whether the federal government should be the one to provide this service. So our final thought and advice to those thinking about starting a life journey program is to start small and have a clear first use case for the life journey map. Trying to build a life journey map and then figure out what to do with it later makes it hard to get organizational commitment to see through an MVP. Whereas having a clear use case can bring vision, excitement, and commitment and lead to the scaling up of the program. Thanks for listening. Reach out to us if you have any questions or feedback. Have a great day.
So our second speaker is Pia Andrews, who works within the public sectors of Australia, New Zealand and Canada to enable greater transparency, democratic engagement, citizen-centric design and real pragmatic actual innovation in the public sector and beyond. She's recently relocated to Broome in Western Australia and is working on some exciting new projects. So Pia, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And just to first acknowledge that I come to you from the land of the Yaru people, and just want to acknowledge their continued contributions to our society and culture and knowledge. So I thought I'd talk to you just briefly about some of the recommended transformations for better services, building a little on what we've just heard. I'm going to have a slide deck. You'll all have access to the slide deck afterwards, and I'll keep it fairly brief, but hopefully there will be some considerations and ideas in there that will stimulate some of our conversation. So I'll just share my screen and give you this. So I'm going to talk about 4 very specific areas: service models, trust, policy, and digital. So first of all, of course, we're going to continue seeing emerging trends in tech and social trends. And I think that one of the traps that we often fall into as public sector is trying to react to a trend. Oh, blockchain, what's our response to blockchain? Ooh, 3D printing, what's our reaction to 3D printing? And the problem is that we end up becoming quite reactive to change. And of course, with continuous rolling emergencies, as the UNDP's Next Gen event showed a couple of years ago, are now the norm. And so we need to figure out how to become less reactive and more responsive. Change is exponentially growing. A lot of our levers and ways of working are fairly linear. And so what's happened is we are seeing an exponentially growing needs gap between the need of society and our ability to respond. So how do we create exponential response to exponential change? And of course, COVID has been the paradoxical situation, which has made this more important than ever. It, on one hand, exacerbated the gaps and showed just how brittle and challenging some of our systems were across the world. At the same time, it created an appetite for change, but at the same time, it also accelerated iteration because everyone just pressed harder on the levers that we already have. I guess the result of this is that change is not an option. Choosing your change is your option. So we need to. So to just briefly look at transformation, there are different, as I've seen around the world and have experienced and led in several jurisdictions, there tends to be 3 models for service delivery, and people don't, until you stand back and look at these models, it's sometimes hard to look at systemic change to the customer or citizen experience of our services. We range from fully integrated services right through to completely distributed. And if you look at jurisdictions like Service New South Wales, like obviously Estonia and South Korea, there are some jurisdictions, not a majority at this point, that actually have consolidated their services, consolidated the channels of service delivery. They have one point of connection, one department which is responsible for the client or citizen or customer, whatever term you want to use, experience with government. And all of the portfolios actually sit behind that. They have effectively virtualized the service delivery layer of government so that they can create an end-to-end delightful experience for users, for citizens, where portfolios still manage their programs and their portfolios and their business systems, but the front end of user engagement with government is able to be consolidated and made excellent. At the other end of the spectrum, fully distributed, almost every government has a single all-government website, information site, where you can get information about government. But the moment you need to interact with government, you're being bounced around hundreds of different applications, user interfaces. Even if you have a common digital identity, you are still being bounced around lots of different user interfaces. So you end up with a fragmented experience because every department is running their own service delivery channels. And then in the middle, you have some governments such as Canada that has shifted to partial consolidation, and they're on the way to fully integrated consolidation of those channels. So the levers that support these are quite different, and this is where it gets quite interesting, again, stepping back and looking at models. The levers that many departments and governments are familiar with are on the distributed side. If you've got every department responsible for their own channels, their own services, their own customer interaction, then the only way you can get consistency and high quality of service across the whole of government domain is through standards, through assurance, budgetary controls, digital capability uplift across the entire government, heavy governance, procurement controls, etc. But even if you land all of that, and no one has, even if you land all of that, you still get a fragmented customer experience because you're still having to go from this department to this department to this department to figure it out. We still put the onus of figuring it out on the citizen. And of course, with government continuously changing our structure and mandates, that becomes a very confusing and difficult thing for citizens to navigate. At the other end of the spectrum, once you have, if you choose to take on a fully integrated approach, a consolidated channels approach, the levers are different. You need a government entity which has a mandate to own the customer experience end to end. You need, but you can then consolidate the best digital capabilities, the best experts, the best processes into that entity. You then end up with agencies mandated to integrate with that channel, and you end up having to adopt, best of breed product management, service design, etc., into that entity. But you don't have to rely on every department being the best. When you have distributed services, service delivery, then everyone is only as good as the worst last experience that a person had with any one department. So there are frameworks for this, for drawing out and creating a virtualized presentation layer to government, as it were, in a way which is scalable, adaptive, etc. And there's many of those to share. The life journeys you just heard about, you heard about some of the opportunities and challenges. The real, and what I've observed and seen in various jurisdictions, opportunity of that is it truly does put the citizen at the centre, and it creates a model for service design and for not just looking at a better individual service, but looking at the role that government can play on that journey and how we can actually partner with other service providers on that journey along the way. So it actually gets into a whole of journey reform opportunity, as we've seen overseas. And of course, you can then bring other lenses, such as Indigenous and First Nation knowledge systems and lenses to those journeys. So secondly, just evolving trust. There's a myth that says you can either have better privacy or better services, choose one. And my experience is that it's simply untrue. Modern technology can actually lead to better privacy and better services. You can use confidentialized computing, verifiable claims, federated data infrastructure. There are so many techniques where an individual can be interacting with just-in-time permissions that doesn't require bulk copy and pasting of data around the system to achieve a more personalized service. And there are many examples of that now. But this actually leads us immediately to trust, because the moment you start talking about data, you immediately have to get to trust. And the fact is that we are all dealing with a challenge around trust, which is something to do with how our models are, or are struggling to adapt to a digital and internet paradigm, and also something to do with how our citizens are being proactively gamed by all kinds of organisations and entities, both human and machine. So if we're living in that environment where our citizens are challenged with trying to figure out truth, authenticity, what is genuine, how to interact with, what they can trust, then we need to be thinking quite carefully about how can we create trustworthy government. So for me, the pillars of trustworthy government are high veracity, ensuring that you can trust the data, the algorithms, the appealability, auditability, traceability to law. Human centricity, of course, being aware that machines are users of our systems and policies just as much as, even more so than human users now, and planning for that. And of course, actually empowering our workforce. So I won't go into these into great depth, but there's some more information there for you. But realizing that actually empowering our own internal public servants to be effective agents for excellence, for diligence, and for a highly ethical outcomes and outputs of everything that we do is a critical part of scaling an effective public service. Evolving policy delivery. If we keep maintaining this linear throw over the fence approach to policy, we're going to continue having a broken policy delivery life cycle where policies are not able to adapt to reality and reality is struggling to implement or understand the original policy intent. Shifting to a more agile, adaptive, test-driven and multidisciplinary approach where the entire policy lifecycle includes policy and delivery experts along the whole path, including design experts, will actually help us be a more adaptive sector and actually shifting away from a highly manual process and into one that helps improve the modelling and understanding of the impact of change is going to be critical. And the final point I wanted to make is just the realisation, the final transformation is transforming what we mean by digital, which sounds a little tongue-in-cheek, but I still see so many digital transformation programs which are fundamentally still just digitizing or automating what we currently do. And the challenge is that the world has actually changed around us fundamentally. And if we don't shift paradigms, then we will still, as I mentioned at the beginning, be applying linear levers to an exponential problem. So shifting from being reactive to being proactive, from digital being a fringe team to being a distributed capability across the sector. Shifting from having a digital channel to having Gov as a platform and omni-channels, shifting from process automation to design-led systems, from using tech on people to starting to engage in participatory governance where we co-design with communities the policies and services they rely upon and have to use, shifting from centralized and closed delivery to distributed and open delivery, and from measuring success financially to measuring outcomes holistically. Of course, some of this is also going to the cultural shift from reacting to change to being proactive about change and designing better futures rather than running away from the past, and empowering our staff to succeed. So the final thought I'll leave you on is that we did collectively create all of this. We invented all of it. And if we don't reinvent it, who will? It's a critical point to finish on, because I think too often people say, oh, it's all too big, and if it's in place, it must be because it's inherently good. And the fact is that the world has changed, and therefore so must we. Thank you.
Kia ora, Pia. Thank you. Our third and final presenter, Sim Sikut, was Digital Policy Advisor in the Government Office of Estonia until late 2021, coordinating digital policy planning and execution across the government, plus advising the Prime Minister on e-governance matters. Sim is one of the founders of Estonia's groundbreaking e-residency program. He's worked as an economic policy and public governance expert in Estonian Development Fund, which is a public economic foresight think tank. And he's now a partner at Digital Nation, building future-ready digital societies, and founder at Digi Exponent, powering change makers. Over to you, Sim.
Thank you, Claire, for the kind words, and hello to everyone. Pia is always a tough act to follow, and I really hope you heard the mission call, because there clearly, it's a quite big changes that are possible in our hands. My talk today was perhaps to share a bit of, let's say, practical, so we'll get a bit very sort of down to the details of, let's say, how to do some of the stuff we're talking about here, and then obviously we can talk more over discussion. Let me just share my screen in a bit. All right, if you can allow me to share, but I'll start talking in the meantime. So in Estonia, we have been on a digital path for 20, 25 years now. We started going digital really for the reasons that we are as small as we are. So we are 1.3 million people. I know it sounds in your region, especially very, very small and tiny, but I think in a way, I think that's our superpower, because that made us realize that we have to be very effective in how we do things. And literally not just digitize, although that's what we've been doing most of the stuff, but as Pia said, I mean, go beyond that in a way. If I cut the long story short, where we stand today in Estonia, and I think this is the context really to me speaking here, we stand at a point where almost anything and everything you need or want to do with the government, at least, you can do online. So digital services are there. The only few exceptions where you still actually have to show up is to get married, get divorced. And this is because of we want to really make sure you know what you're doing. And I'm not joking here. So everything else beyond that, I mean, any sort of bureaucracy you can think about, there's a digital way to get it done from wherever you are in the world. So obviously from a distance. It's the same for citizens. The services are not mandatory, so physical options are there as well. But it's also the same for entrepreneurs. So, and for them, by the way, it's mandatory. So if you start a company, all the rest has to happen digitally with our government. So that's as far as all the bureaucracy is concerned, or let's say transactional services as they're called. But obviously the digital goes beyond that, into the back offices, goes into the core of the public service change in the areas like health, education, and so on. Now, what we found through all of this was that even though we built all these things up digitally, that doesn't mean that it actually, first of all, does the best thing from users' point of view. And secondly, what we see is that if we are out there for effectiveness, even if we have put it online, doesn't really make it more effective always and necessarily. So a lot what the Estonian government has been working on, and me there for the last sort of 10 years, is to try to make at least the bureaucracy happen invisibly in the back end. So exactly linking it up or joining it up, making it more automatic like that, making it more proactive. So automatic in the case, like, for example, if a child is born, immediately he or she has a medical insurance. We have a public insurance here. So no application for that. Automatically it starts like that. Or proactive, the fact that we don't need to exactly wait up if something starts to happen. If we know that all the way to services, like if we know that some region is experiencing socioeconomic troubles, we might already send or direct more unemployment services that way. But the most what we have been working on is exactly making stuff joined up. And I know there's several buzzwords for that. You know, you can call it seamless, you can call it integrated, whatever is the word. The whole point being that just as with Canada, with life journeys and many other governments, people actually experience the need to get something done in buckets, in sort of bundles. And we saw that clearly from the other side as well, not just talking to the people or being a user ourselves, but it shows up from data as well. You can really see from data that this sort of service points of delivery happen in bundles like that. So when we started making stuff more invisible, we clearly took up the challenge of not just digitizing those services now, they are digital, but really redesigning them to work as one. This has been a track for the last, we've been getting this going. Now this year, 2022, you see a small roadmap here. The government now is basically one by one tackling them and redesigning them and starting to bring them live. And the whole point being, whatever happens in your life, there's about 15 core events defined for, let's say, citizens' life, core journeys. So whatever these happens, it should be basically one interaction, ideally proactive, then you get stuff done. So in a way, it's still a journey for the government too, because it's not done deal. It has taken quite a bit of time for that. It goes also beyond the individual's life to entrepreneurs. So we also tackle like business events and stuff. And by the way, it goes into, I'll skip a slide, goes into also private sector ends. So quite a few journeys we're thinking about how do they really start beyond government as well. So for example, here you have an example that, you know, if taxes are due, we could immediately, when I pay in my company, myself for my salary, I can immediately get the taxes done. So that's where that journey, that's what sort of, you know, experience start from a private sector interface like that. So basically there's quite a bit of work in our hands is my point. But why we do it? We do it really for the sake to exactly make it easy to get stuff done for the people. Because at least in Estonia, a good government experience is not dealing with bureaucracy, even if it is online. That's what people want to be done with and get away with as smooth as possible. And this sort of the benefit and the aim is that they would be able to direct their time to stuff that actually matters, their family, work, whatever. And the government, on the other hand, can direct attention to the cases that need our attention, not the standard stuff that just, you know, can be handled automatically or by the machines. We can also provide more basically valuable services that really help people more. What we have learned from this, and I will end just a few things, perhaps a few things too many. It's still an ongoing learning. So first of all, we clearly have seen that we have to keep the user in the focus. And this is, you know, ABC of digital government or digital transformation knowledge, but really. And why I say this is that we went in designing the journeys from the perspective and principle that there should be one interaction per life event, that's it. But what we have already found is that, I mean, sometimes people want to have more. So for example, with childbirth, the expecting mothers actually prefer to have a few touch points because they want to change things, so forth. So my point being, we have to be tuned to really build a service that users expect and want from us. Secondly, all this, I'm saying something obvious now, all this stuff is possible with data. If you want to join up stuff, data has to flow. Yeah, and that means that there has to be good quality data. You have to invest into data governance. We have to invest into making stuff shareable, and your interoperability has to be there. In Estonia, our luck is that we built up early on a platform for that called X-Road, but that's only the technology part of it. So we have to solve really for the data stuff to make it happen. And that's why I think the topic and how the seminar here is outlined is very timely for that. Risks. We'll talk more about them in the chat, I think. But what we have also found, there are risks, yeah, for privacy, for security, but these can be managed. And we will talk about longer how. But we also see that often the other barrier that people say to joining up the government is that no, laws don't allow us to do it. Well, we have seen that laws actually not only you can reduce the barrier in the law, you can just basically allow for joining up, but laws can also give you a kick in the direction. It can be an enabler. So we brought in, for example, a rule into law called once only, and that pushed the government to share data for the sake of better service experience. So regulation is a powerful instrument, not just to get rid of barriers, but really to push us in directions. I think there was already a question in the chat here Obviously, if we want to have impactful stuff, we want to have the biggest impact possible with all these things, we have to rethink how we do stuff. So even with building up a journey for the childbirth, I mean, I think at first instance, the team came up with a somehow linked up existing silo process, but we had to rethink and actually make it really redesign the stuff that made it powerful and happen in one interaction. So digital is a great chance to take things to the next level. If you don't use it, that can work too. It can still bring some benefits, but we are limiting our potential. And perhaps one of the last points, each time Estonia has failed, we made stuff too complex. We can't handle the complexity given how small we are, but I think, everyone should prefer to have an easier life. So I think the point here is that if we go about digitizing stuff, if we build up, joined up governance, I mean, there's so many complexity around anyway. If we bring different agencies together, stuff like that, we have to be relentlessly trying to keep it simple, going back to it, challenging us, how can we make it more simple again? That's the way to get it done. And that means we have to manage the change. I mean, it's called digital transformation for a reason. We have to manage that. And that's the ABCs of change management we have to put in place. And finally, the hardest thing, and this really goes to Pia's message as well, is that even if we in Estonia have been trying to redesign and rebuild the services to be really fully joined up, the governance there doesn't change behind automatically. It's still siloed agencies trying to build this stuff, and that makes it so hard. For example, who's responsible if a joined up service fails? How does that revenues flow between the departments? So actually, we can build interim solutions. We can bring parallel structures to the game, but fundamentally, it actually forces us a challenge to rethink the governance behind, and that's a mighty challenge beyond just making the interface more joined up. My very last point, and I will end my first part here. At the end of the day, there's a lot of complexity. I mean, you try to simplify it. I mean, there's stuff that there might be barriers in the way. If there's one thing to really we have learned in Estonia is that it doesn't matter, just do it, just start. You'll figure it out. Even if you don't have the full plan yet, you'll figure it out on the go. So I thank you here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Sim. There are three very interesting presentations, and I was going to do a wee bit of a sum up, but I'm going to move into the panel discussion because there's some good questions coming through and we want to get to them. So just a couple of introductory remarks that the leaps in digital public service are mirrored by and in many cases follow technological advances in private sector service provision and the use of big data sets to analyse and predict market trends, customer preference and prevent fraudulent activities. Well, this is all accompanied by significant advances in automated decision-making, which poses opportunities and risks for both the public and the private sectors and the populations that they target and serve. And automated decision-making can be used to increase equity, inclusion and well-being for populations like applying for a job or a loan or needing surgery. It might be automated decision-making might be used to determine if the application is accepted or how far up the waiting list you are. Some uses of automated decision-making are controversial and they can lead to bias or negative effects on people. And an example of that is facial recognition technologies, which can exhibit systemic racial and gender bias. It's been around for decades, but automated decision-making uses and impacts, they're increasing as more data is collected and stored and computing power and storage increases. And these pose considerable challenges for governments that use automated decision-making, for example, in criminal justice, immigration, social development, transport. It's important that these systems aren't only trusted, but trustworthy for governments to maintain and build social licence. A recent research report commissioned for the New Zealand government from the Digital Council for Aotearoa New Zealand found that transparent and clear communication about how the government used automated decision-making to make decisions was essential for public trust, and that these systems should be built with and for the people who are impacted based on a set of rules and best practice. So two of our presenters, Pia and Sem, have kindly agreed to participate in the discussion, so I don't need to introduce them to you again. They're joined by Professor Colin Gavigan, who is Director of the New Zealand Law Foundation, Centre for Law and Policy in Emerging Technologies. He's the first chair of the New Zealand Police's Advisory Panel on Emergent Technologies and a member of the Digital Council for Aotearoa, which advises the New Zealand government on digital technologies. And he was also a key author of that research paper that I just mentioned above. And the link to that paper will be provided in the notes that we give to you. I'll start by asking the panelists, what do you believe are the inherent tensions between data privacy and better joined up services to citizens? And Colin, would you like to start?
Kia ora, Claire, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I should probably start by saying, so I am a lawyer and a legal academic, so I'm very much at the kind of challenges and pitfalls end of this conversation. So I should start by saying that these are perhaps inherent tensions, but I don't think they're necessarily irresolvable tensions. They're simply matters that have to be kept in mind by any government and any agency proceeding down this road. I guess it depends very much what we're talking about. I think a couple of the speakers have teased out a distinction here between a system that allows citizens access to information and a system that makes decisions that will impact them. And these two situations give rise to potentially different risks and concerns for me. I mean, in terms of data sharing, it very much depends how it's done, but the possibility of disparate kinds of information about us being held in one place obviously creates or has the potential to create certain kinds of vulnerabilities. I take very much Pia's point that this isn't inevitable, that there are technological and other solutions, but I think some of the solutions, in my experience, have to be cultural as well. A recognition that just because information might prove useful somewhere down the line, it doesn't mean that it could be held or should be held, or that we have a license to hold it. I think this is the other thing about data sharing, really, is this idea that people maybe give over their personal information for one purpose. Perhaps they're applying for a benefit or a driver's license. And there is a concern about that information being repurposed and used for very different things, perhaps things that they're really not so happy about. Claire, you gave the example of facial recognition technology. And one of the big concerns we've had here in the last couple of years is the idea of how these systems will be trained, what kind of data sets they'll be trained upon, and the idea that perhaps people who are happy enough for photographic representations of them to be held for the purposes of, say, driver's licenses or passports may not be so happy about them being used to train police facial recognition technologies. So the fact that we have a license and a permission to hold citizens' information for one purpose doesn't necessarily give us carte blanche to use it for just anything else. So these are just some things to think about. As I say, I don't think any of them are irresolvable. There are good and bad examples of how they've been used, but they're just some matters to keep in mind.
Sem or Pia?
Yeah,
go ahead.
go.
No, you go ahead.
Sorry. Well, just a few things. Well, perhaps for the sake of discussion as well, I think if we frame it as tension, we do see and get tension. If we frame it as basically, let's say, how do we solve that there is no tension? Basically, how do we make them compatible like that? I think that already gives us a bit of the key to really fixing for both in a way. So that's been the approach we have at least tried to take in Estonia, is to say that there's not like there's a tension, rather we have to exactly manage for privacy and ensure privacy along the lines like Colin was saying, and then stuff can happen. There's technology you can use, and Pia was hinting on that. There's a lot you can do with sort of procedural safeguards, all the way to, obviously we would say that, look, at the end of the day, ultimately this trust and protection of privacy starts from having good rule of law, right? So there's always a recourse if stuff happens. So there's building blocks you can put in place for that. But it's not because there's tension, because that's the enabler to have the trust and to be digital as a country. So that's been also thinking, at least in this realm. And secondly, a lot of it, I just want to go back to, let's say, the ADM sort of question like that. A lot of it, what we're talking about here today, at least, when it comes to really joining up, from service delivery point of view, that's not big data stuff. that small data at best, right? Or even just like designing things in a sort of better way like that. And so from my point of view, what we always try to say in these debates is that there is no one solution fits all. We actually have to be talking a bit more segmented in a way. What is it? What is the service at hand that we are considering in terms of privacy? Getting an automated medical insurance for the newborn is not as privacy intrusive as profiling for a service and then trying to sort of, hands in proactively go and somehow, help a risk child out. So the degrees of that, doing something in criminal justice is quite different than basically doing something, for example, with ADM for seamless company registration. So the risk again for, harm of life or whatever are different. So I think the approach has to be a bit more calibrated in this practical implementation of all of that.
Before you leap in, Pia, I just wondered if, just taking one of the questions from Sioli Tonga, around what are some of the low-hanging fruit digital initiatives that could be useful for demonstrating value quickly and securing buy-in? Obviously, but this is buy-in across government, because some of the issues that we have to deal with in this is actually getting that buy-in across government for these sorts of initiatives. Is there anything that can work well in terms of getting buy-in and establishing trust?
So I'll jump in on that and also try to address a little bit of the previous. First of all, I think that trust is in the public sector, in all of our public sectors, there's been a habit over the last few decades of trying to get trust by social license, basically saying, what is the public happy for us to do? And then that could be the carte blanche, the framework in which we can do whatever we want. And the problem is that the public expectations of how much or little they trust government is itself continuously changing. So it's a downward spiral of people saying, how much do you trust us? Well, I guess I trust you. How much do you trust us? Well, a little bit less right now. How much do you trust us? Well, I don't trust you at all. So it's getting worse. I would suggest that there is a different approach that I have definitely used, and it has worked very well, which is to start saying, how can we be more trustworthy? Which I think involves a couple of things. First of all, it involves actually being part of civil society, not seeing government as completely separate to civil society, and actually saying to the public, we want you to be able to trust us. We don't want to just do what you say you're happy for us to do. What would it take for you to trust us? And of course, that will be different for an intelligence agency than it will be for a social services agency, but it's still a good question. So public engagement on what it would take for the public to trust you, which of course will be different for every culture and every jurisdiction, number one. Number two, just applying the basic principles of administrative law or whatever your local equivalent is to digital. Most government systems have no traceability to what the legal premise, the legal authority of that decision or action was. The systems we have in place are black boxes. A person is being told, computer says no, they're not being told why computer says no, and they have no means of understanding or appealing a decision except through a manual process where a different team will manually go and assess your case and then probably give you a different answer than the machine gave you, which is with no feedback loop going back into the machine. So building our systems to have traceability to law, traceability to authority, to be automatically being audited so that we can see patterns of change, and most importantly, to be appealable to a user, to a citizen. A citizen should not just be told yes or no. They should be told yes or no and why, based on what information, and then have a record of that so that they can then go and appeal it. So we don't have a situation where 10 years down the track, they're told, we paid you money 10 years ago, now we're going to want that back unless you can prove why we gave it to you, which is actually what's happening today. So to go back to the low-hanging fruit, here is my biggest recommendation from my experience. My biggest recommendation is everyone above and around you will always ask you to spend 100% of your time on low-hanging fruit. Build this app, do this thing, fix this problem, get me 15% efficiency. My strongest recommendation to you is to carve out time in your program for something else, for the long-term projects, for the long-term you know, what's the future we're trying to get to? What's the change we're trying to adopt? What's the vision that we're trying to get to? And it might only be 10% of your resource that you can put in those long-term planning and objectives to be more proactive. But if you have 100% of your time and effort being reactive, you will never change the status quo. You will at best perpetuate it, and you will speed up sprinting off a cliff.
So that speaks to I guess to a degree, and a number of questions have been asked around this, a degree of culture change within the public service. Sim, how did you address that? And and also Colin, perhaps, what are the, I guess, what from your perspective, where is that culture change most needed in across government?
Yes, well, first of all, here to Pia, in a sense that, and things goes to your question, Claire, as well. I think working on a culture change like that is an example of some of the long-term stuff you have to do on the side, or you want to do on the side. So if you look around the world, I've recently spoken to a few dozens of great digital leaders, peers from other governments. The best ones of them really combine stuff into portfolio, not just the low-hanging fruits, which you have to do, yes, but always sort of trying to do long-term structural stuff to build up capability, to fix not to fix, but to build the culture, to build platforms, whatever it might be. Now on the culture stuff. So back in the early days, the approach was quite sort of classic in the sense that, let's get people in the room and try to educate them and evangelize, and stuff will happen. But I think what we clearly know by now, and what was a lot of my personal mission in the government, was to say that culture is created through practice, not through somehow training, right? So basically we had to start doing stuff differently, and out of that the culture can stick and emerge and evolve like that. So we really took the chance, and I think what I would advocate for is to say that you want digital to be everywhere, yes, but somehow there has to be a nucleus team somewhere in government, better be, that just drives that and sort of, basically builds up the practice and, builds up what good looks like and stuff like that. So through that, it can spread. So basically, in a complicated way, what I'm trying to say is that culture change has to happen, but it can't somehow be forced. You have to start doing stuff differently, build up the critical mass and momentum of that, and culture will change through that. It can't be changed for you and then it's ready and then you come and do the stuff.
Yeah. Colin.
I totally agree with what both Pia and this is going to be a boring panel if I keep saying that, but I do agree with what they both said. And Sim's point about having a champion within government, I think, is important. New Zealand's just a small country, but even given that, the amount of churn within government departments has made it quite difficult to establish, who the person driving this kind of change is going to be. The Digital Council has been in existence for just over 2 years. We've had 3 ministers and about 4 different turnovers of civil servants. So that's I don't think they're going to change that anytime soon, but it is a problem with which we're having to contend. I think there's a lot of goodwill though in the people we've spoke to. They say the right things. They're concerned about co-design. They're concerned about governance. They're concerned about transparency. One thing that we've started, I think the Digital Council, with some of the work we did in the Trust project, and that really is quite, I think, necessary, is before we start deciding whether digital is a solution, let's make sure we've identified the right problem. And that probably involves conversations with the kind of people who are not normally on these kind of panels, quite honestly, people who are often at the sharp end of these decisions and these processes. And that's what we did. We convened some panels to actually speak to, workshops to speak to people who were in that position. And what we found was that they had very nuanced and very informed positions on a lot of these issues, but their trust or their distrust, the problems with the trust were less with the technology and more with their experience in with dealing with government and dealing with government departments. And that's something you're not going to change overnight, and you're not going to change that by moving services to a particular digital platform. That has to be earned, and it has to be built, and it has to be kept. So I don't think that's going to change. That side of the culture is something that has to be rebuilt, I think, or at least that's our experience here. So yeah, that's just a couple of thoughts.
So Colin, Simon Morris asks an interesting question. Are the agencies and departments using the data the best place to be the stewards of citizen data, or should it be independent third party that asks the citizen for permission to release the relevant data to the agency delivering the service?
Oh, I think like most people working in tech ethics, Claire, have become a little bit cynical about kind of notice and consent models. If you really don't have any choice, there's only one party delivering some of those services, and that's government. So asking for your consent is sometimes a little bit kind of nominal. But in terms of data sharing, in theory, I mean, our law, our Due Privacy Act, has pretty good rules around the circumstances in which that should be allowed to happen, I think. I like the idea of having some kind of maybe all of government watchdog body to monitor compliance with these kinds of things. I mean, we have the Privacy Commissioner here who's partly responsible for that, but maybe my team suggested maybe we ought to have something of that nature for ADM, that both, it's not just a watchdog, it's there to kind of build capacity, it's there to provide best practice examples and guidance for, I mean, the starting point really ought to be good faith people trying to do this properly, but also keeping an eye on those who get sloppy with it. I think there's something to be said for that kind of approach. Now, there's all different ways it can be done. Canada's got one model for that. The UK has done something a bit different with the CDEI, but I think it's something that could certainly merit some closer attention.
Sim or Pia, do you have any comments on that? On the stewardship of data?
I might pop in first this time, Sim. I think that partly it's about ensuring that you really embrace that idea that it's about having a dignified experience for the citizen. If you start from the premise that we are, well, the public sector is a steward for long-term public good, not just a steward for the current minister's agenda or steward for the current government's agenda or steward for the short-term, cost efficiency program. If you actually really adopt the long-term steward of public good, then, and as a principle, then how we deal with data can follow that principle. Are we giving the user a choice? Are we maintaining their dignity? Are we protecting against a potential bad use case? There's a good reason why I believe so strongly in federated data architecture, in specifically not sharing, copying and pasting data around the system, which creates all kinds of issues, but keeping it at source, accessing it through confidentialized computing, through verifiable data. I mean, why do we ask a person to provide a payslip? Usually the legislation doesn't say, give me a payslip and I'll give you a benefit. It usually says the person needs to meet a means test. So why can't we say, hey, Colin, hey, Sim, hey, Claire, do you give me permission as the social service department to just verify that you meet the means test? And if they say yes, I can say, okay, taxation department, does Colin meet test 27? And I only need to get a yes, no. I don't need to see your payslip with all of the associated personal information, which has nothing to do with my legislative requirement. And even if the data does have to be shared, I could say, hey, Colin, are you happy for me to share the data for this purpose? And if you know that data is not going to be used for another purpose, that's going to make you more comfortable. So rather than trying to say, do you give me permission to use all your data all the time in any way I want or not? We should be able to say, why not have just-in-time permissions on a per-case basis? This is where I do genuinely believe that the X-Road system that Estonia put in place is exceptional, because it has all the technical foundations to enable fantastic use of data without compromising on privacy or security. Over to you, Sim.
Thanks for the heads up, exactly. What I perhaps want to add here is to say that somehow, obviously, data stewardship needs to be in place, but I think, and I have seen there are different governance models basically solve it differently, as long as it's somehow there, right? But fundamentally, I think for the point of resilience, but also from the point that even going to design and sort of easier and more agile realignment of stuff, you want to keep things sort of small and but connected. And that's a lot goes to what Pia was sort of saying. So what I'm trying to get to is to say that it pays off to build up stuff granularly, but would that necessarily mean that one agency handles data and others handle the services? Not necessarily, I would say. It depends on the governance structure. It depends on what sort of checks and balances you can build in perhaps differently. I'm giving a very vague answer, I understand, but this is just me saying that there are many models how it can be solved for. The point here is that it can be solved for.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to a practical question now. Somebody's asked about getting started on the life journey mapping and the kind of getting started and the amount of time that it might take. I guess that's a bit like how long is a piece of string question. But if you're getting started and you're taking a life journey, what kind of timing is involved to get to a point where you might have something, a deliverable?
So I'll jump in on this one. So I've set up 2 life journey programs now, inspired and influenced by the New Zealand life journey program. And then we went and expanded and scaled a bit in New South Wales and Canada. I like to deliver things fast, deliver value to the public as fast as possible with minimum viable products that we can then continue to build on, but we don't hold up delivering value to the public until we have something, 5 years down the track. So the approach that we took and that I encouraged my team to take and that we delivered on was 3 months is about all you need to establish a team, identify, a first journey. It actually doesn't matter which journey, so long as it actually helps real people. You don't need to spend 2 years, prioritizing which is the best possible place to start when you could just start somewhere. To take a slice of that journey, identify the other service providers and create a bit of shared governance around that journey, and to establish what are the how might we's that we can solve for in that journey. And then about another 3 months should be more than enough to having identified some specific opportunities and MVP opportunities to build an MVP. So you should be able to get the first actual product out easily within 6 months that you can then continue to build upon. And that's the way that we approached it. Was step 1, stage 1 of a life journey based service is almost inevitably an information service that just integrates the information. But step 2 is where it gets much more profound from a value to customer, which is the in the integration of services, or in the creating of reusable service components, or in saying, oh, rather than getting 20 better steps in this 20-step process, actually these 5 steps, everyone that comes to these 5 steps necessarily takes this step. So why don't we incorporate it? As they did with the New Zealand Smart Start, they identified, not everyone that needs to get an ID is, is born in New Zealand, but for everyone that is born in New Zealand, at the point of birth registration, why don't we say, would you like to have this child registered for a tax number? Would you like them registered for a student number or for a health number? That then meant that lots of people were automatically getting those things sorted because they looked at the journey as a whole. So just starting with an MVP and getting early delivery out doesn't take long. We actually built in Canada that Julie and Stephanie and the team can share with you. We built a whole repeatable process, which is quite good, and a bit of a playbook for it. But the key value to it was actually working with the other service providers, because suddenly, and New Zealand did this as well, suddenly you have, not just the various departments on that journey realizing that the same customer is not, your customer and your customer and your customer and your customer. It's the same person. And how do we collectively serve this person better? But also bringing in the non-government entities, having, the childcare and the Midwives Association as part of that conversation helps us as government to get out of the habit of, well, here's what my minister wants or what my portfolio says, and actually brings a little bit more humanity to the conversation. Just making it a bit more humane and human-oriented is a huge step to then informing our work. I hope that helps. More than happy to follow up with anyone who'd like to.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. I just also another question, which I think is quite an interesting question to pose, is with the technology platforms that are maturing, should public services start moving to trust-based model, which is decentralized? Colin may have some views on this as well, but Sim, what's your view on that?
I think my view can already be guessed from a presentation of sorts. Like, we really fundamentally believe in, first of all, distributed setup even within our own government. But even, let's say, when I was speaking about, let's say, how journeys reach beyond our public sector and can start or at least be partially taken care of in private sector and so forth, that's only, well, I don't want to use the word inevitable, nothing's inevitable, but I think that would be really just for the sake of the user's sort of perspective as well, right? Especially because, I'll give you just one more perspective. In Estonia, at least, and I think it holds for most of countries, we come across government only a few times when we have to. Whereas we come across these other sort of encounters in our life, daily or whatever basis. So think about it this way, an online bank, if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm daily, or my accountant might be daily in, right? So basically it makes sense to make it stuff easy to get stuff done from there, as opposed to then, have them go to a monthly reporting duty for some other website or application or whatever, get stuff done. So if you really want to improve their lives for more efficiency or for better experience, whatever, we better sort of reach out like that. So that's at least sort of for my view here. I want to add just one bit to Pia's remarks on getting the life journeys going. I think clearly in the world of public sector, we have a lot of analysis paralysis, right, as it is called. So I just want to echo again the stuff to get going. That was my point with just do it as well. But I wanted to say one more thing, just perhaps one small tip. Often these mapping exercises, even if you do them, right, or the product building starts by getting the agencies at the table, agencies involved in the life journey. And that's good too, because you want to have buy-in. But what we found out, the most of mistake was that get the users first. 2 hours with the users in let's say focus group stuff, you have pretty much the mapping done, and that will inform you much more than the agency's views on as-is stuff.
Colin, do you have views on the decentralization question?
I don't know that I particularly have a view on that question, Claire, but there's a couple of things that come up from both Pia's and Sim's comments. If I may, I'll just very quickly kind of comment on those. I mean, I totally get the paralysis analysis thing. It's been frustrating for my team and for Digital Council as well from that point of view. But it's one thing to get a system up and running. I think it's also quite important, it's depending what it is, again, the devil's always in the detail, but to check that it's working, to check that it's not delivering sort of perverse outcomes and that isn't working. So we quite regularly, not blaming any entity for this, but it's quite common within government to hear about trialing new systems where there's not really any established methodology or any kind of idea of how are you actually going to check that it's better than what we had before. How can you check that it's not leaving out or bias is creeping into it or whatever it might be. The leaving out parts come up a few times in the questions too, and leaving behind. I think that's really important. Are we talking about supplementing existing ways of accessing services or replacing them? If we're talking about replacing phone lines and physical premises with an entirely digital system, then we do have to think about that percentage of the population that's going to struggle with that for various reasons. I mean, Estonia is a very famously digitally enabled and competent country, and New Zealand's not bad, but we do have a significant cohort of our population who would probably struggle with that, and that's something I think that needs to be considered as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I think, look, this is great discussion. There's more questions in the chat, but it's time to wrap up. So I really want to thank you all for coming and asking all of the participants for asking such great questions. And of course, a huge thank you to our panel and presenters, Pia Andrews, Sim Sikut, and Julie Bedard and Stephanie Figgis, as well as Professor Colin Gavigan. I hope that everyone found it really useful and will help you progress your own discussions. So I'll hand over to Afreen.
I want to actually jump on this opportunity. There's a colleague from Indonesia who's asked a question on political motivation behind digital transformation, not literally extending the conversation, but Claire, you'd be like best to answer this question. We'd like to take this question offline with Claire and the Indonesia country office, because we have a very strategic partnership with the country office. So passing on back to Alex. Thanks everyone for your patience to be with us for more than a 1 hour webinar is a success. Back to you, Alex.
Oh, thanks so much. I actually didn't expect to be talking again, but I'm getting a lot of feedback actually at the background, and I think people are really enjoying this conversation. And it's great that we actually as far as I understand, we're able to touch the pain points, right? And to have a really open and frank discussion about it. And I think this is the spirit we want to keep going forward. We will be communicating on the next round of webinars. But as I said at the beginning, and as the discussion evolved, we really don't want to keep it at the level of the webinars. So our call from the Regional Innovation Center and from Claire as our lead facilitator is actually to continue engagement and to get things moving from design and conversation space to actually doing stuff. With this, I really would like to thank everyone who joined us, panelists in particular, but also all UNDP staff and colleagues from government who were part of this conversation. And we are actually, as I said, looking forward to taking it to the ground and work together with you in the coming weeks, months, and who knows, maybe years. Thank you very much.